Hi, everybody. Welcome to day number 2 of the 2020 International eConference on Atheism. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Dr. Darren Slade. I'm the president of the Global Center for Religious Research. And what's incredible about this 3-day academic conference is that you didn't have to get out of bed. You didn't have to buy a hotel room or an airline ticket to come join us. You get to hear the latest scholarship on the philosophical and scientific study of atheism right from the comfort and safety of your own home. So thank you for being with us today. And I have the distinct pleasure of being able to introduce my good friend, somebody who doesn't actually need an introduction, Mr. John W. Loftus. And he is going to be talking about miracle claims today and arguing that if you don't have objective evidence for a miracle, then they shouldn't be accepted as true. Now, John is a former Christian apologist who studied under William Lane Craig. He holds a master's, an MA, an MDiv, and a master's in theology. He is the author or editor of 11 different books, including Why I Became an Atheist, The Outsider Test for Faith, and Unapologetic. He's also the co-editor of one of my favorites, The Christian Delusion. Now, John's topic today is a spin-off from Christopher Hitchens, who once said, what can be asserted without evidence can also be dismissed without evidence. So one of John's aims today is to argue that Hitchens' stance towards miracles is actually to be preferred over those who advocate something different, like using Bayes' theorem. Now, John's next book that's actually coming out next year by GCRR Press is going to be on horrendous suffering and God. So keep your eye open for that one. I do want to emphasize and highlight his most recent publication, though, called The Case Against Miracles. Now, if you haven't heard or read this book yet, for me to say that this anthology has had a ripple effect, a huge influence in academia, would actually be to undersell the book. Already, this book is being considered the definitive guide on miracle claims and how to properly investigate them, how to properly define a miracle, how to properly address and approach miracles. This book has it all, and it has become such a huge and influential thing that even Bart Ehrman, the noted New Testament scholar, had featured several series on his blog website about this particular book. Oh, and with that said, I am excited to present my good friend, John Loftus.
Hi, I'm John Loftus. Today I'm arguing along the same lines as Christopher Hitchens did, that what can be asserted without evidence can also be dismissed without evidence. Specifically, I'm arguing that miracle claims asserted without relevant objective evidence can be dismissed, period. I think all reasonable people would agree, without any relevant objective evidence, miracle claims should be entertained, considered, believed, or even debunked. I intend to go further to argue that as far as we can tell, all or almost all miracle assertions lack any relevant objective evidence and as such can be dismissed out of hand, per Hitchens. Once there is relevant objective evidence for a miracle claim, that changes matters, for then it shouldn't be dismissed outright. The problem is that all or almost all miracle assertions lack any relevant objective evidence, while none of them has sufficient objective evidence for them. Even if believers disagree, they might still agree that all or almost all the miracle claims of other religions should be dismissed. Like me, they dismissed them out of hand. And on his point, just think of Joseph Smith's supposed miraculous golden plates, the supposed Marian apparitions at Lourdes, France in 1858, the claim that Muhammad flew to heaven on a winged horse, the assertion that Buddha emitted flames from his upper body while gushing forth water from his lower body, or that Lord Shiva drank poison to save the universe. Depending on your own religious enculturation, you too dismiss these other unevidenced miracle claims out of hand because they lack any relevant objective evidence, and rightly so. To be clear, when we dismiss a miracle claim, it doesn't mean we don't have a responsibility to share with believers the reasons why we dismiss it. I think we should explain why, especially if there are a great number of believers in a society who need to know. We should do what judges do before dismissing a court case. They explain why the case is being dismissed so people can understand. Many times it's because there's a lack of evidence, so just say so. Apart from this, there isn't a reason to respond in depth at all. I've also argued elsewhere that ridicule is sometimes an appropriate response. Again, I'm arguing that as far as we can tell, all or almost all miracle assertions lack relevant objective evidence, and as such, they can be dismissed out of hand. In saying this, I cannot deal with every miracle claim. I haven't even heard of them all, much less study them out. Others have done a good job of that, though, especially the amazing James Randi, Joe Nickell, the only full-time paranormal investigator, and Skeptics Society Michael Shermer, so I refer to them. From the outset, I'm forced to admit we cannot, technically speaking, completely rule out the possibility of a God who performs hidden, unevidenced miracles. God may do them, despite the fact that no reasonable person should believe that he did. This technicality won't grant believers any hope to pry open the floodgates of their sect-specific miracle assertions, though, for three good reasons. For one, if a God performs hidden, unevidenced miracles, then no reasonable person should ever believe he does them. Reasonable people need sufficient objective evidence to accept them. Unevidenced miracle claims, by definition, have no evidence for them, so they might as well not occur at all. They would not be able to produce reasonable belief, though, if belief was important to a God. That should be the end of it. For two, if a God does these miracles, believers must show why organ failures, viruses, and the things we eat are always the best explanation for why we get sick, rather than curses or spells. They must also show why the best explanation for healings comes from a doctor-prescribed medicine rather than prayers, which don't work any more than chance. The extremely strong trend is that science is working whereas God is not. As science advances, God retreats. Miracle explanations have become unnecessary because they never worked in the first place. For three, if a good God does hidden, unevidenced miracles, then why aren't they being done to alleviate the most horrendous sufferings in the world? Well, God could have stopped the underwater earthquake that caused the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami before it happened, thus saving 250,000 lives. If God did that, none of us would ever know he did. But since there are many clear instances of horrendous suffering where God should have intervened with miracles but didn't, we can reasonably conclude he doesn't do hidden, unevidenced miracles at all. In my anthology, The Case Against Miracles, I wrote the chapter Extraordinary Claims Require Extraordinary Evidence. There I described three types of claims about the objective world and the evidence needed to accept them. First, there are ordinary claims. They require only a small amount of fair evidence. These are claims about events that take place regularly and every day, and as such require only the testimonial evidence of someone who is trustworthy under normal circumstances. If a trustworthy woman tells us she saw a car accident on Main Street, we would believe her. If a trustworthy man tells us he just talked to his mother on the phone, we would believe him. There's no reason not to. Two, there are extraordinary claims, which are about events that are extremely unusual within the world of nature and require a relatively large amount of solid objective evidence depending on how extraordinary the claim is. If someone claimed he sank 18 holes in one in a row on a standard golf course, we would simply scoff at him. Testimonial evidence alone is almost always insufficient for establishing an extraordinary claim like that. We need extraordinary levels of objective evidence to believe him. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence which entails sufficient corroborating objective evidence commensurate with the nature of the extraordinary claim. That means sufficient objective evidence should be sufficient, regardless of whether it's a large amount of good evidence or a small amount of very strong evidence. Three, there are miraculous claims. They're the highest kind of extraordinary claim. A miracle is an event impossible to occur by natural processes alone. There are events which involve the interfering or suspension or transgression or breaching or contravening or violating of natural law. So if we could not believe someone's testimony who claimed to have made 18 holes in one in a row on a standard golf course, we could not believe him 100 times over if he said he flew of his own power from hole to hole. In the case of miracle claims, reasonable people need a boatload of solid objective evidence before accepting them. David Hume said it this way: no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. For Hume, no amount of human testimony is able to overcome the overwhelming evidence of the known laws of nature that the world doesn't act in miraculous ways. Human testimony to a miracle cannot begin to overcome the extremely strong evidence that no scientist has ever conducted an experiment under strict laboratory conditions who received different results than other scientists who conducted the same exact experiment under the same exact conditions. Reasonable people need a lot of solid objective evidence to overcome our firm scientific conviction that the world operates according to regular patterns described by laws, and human testimony is insufficient for the task. The only testimonies that might have some glimmer of hope in establishing a miracle are hypothetically imagined scenarios by the philosophers. But even in these best imagined cases, the testimonies can only equal the overwhelming evidence that the natural operation of the world is uniform and constant. So at best, under the best of scenarios, human testimony cannot establish a miracle. The significant point is that despite imagined hypotheticals, we never find any concrete examples of testimonial evidence that come remotely close to establishing a miracle. Hume concludes, therefore, we may establish it as a maxim that no human testimony can have such force as to prove a miracle and make it a just foundation for any such system of religion. That human testimony to miracles is fallible is known with a great deal of assurance. They are insufficient because people typically misperceive, misunderstand, and misrepresent what they thought they saw, mostly due to a whole host of cognitive biases. Confirmation bias is probably the mother of all biases, for it permits people to see objective evidence where there isn't any, and permits believers to find their faith is strengthened under attack after listening to good arguments like the one I'm making right now. Sometimes people lie about miracles to defraud others. A forensic television show I watched had a character say, the evidence doesn't lie, people do. Establishing miracles requires a sufficient amount of solid objective evidence, not mere testimony, and even far less second, third, fourth-handed hearsay testimony from people who are not eyewitnesses, like what we find in the Bible. Just as hearsay testimony isn't allowed into a courtroom, because we would want to cross-examine any supposed eyewitnesses for accuracy, consistency between other supposed eyewitnesses, and completeness of story being told. We'd especially be interested to know if, like the Mormon witnesses of the supposed golden plates, any of them recanted, which they did. We know that of them, but do we know that of any of the original disciples whose second, third-hand testimonies claimed that they saw the risen Jesus? But if there is no objective evidence and only hearsay testimony, then there isn't even a case. You can just imagine the scenario in the courtroom. Judge says, present your first witness. And the prosecution says, well, there are no eyewitnesses. We have no witnesses. And he says, all right, well, then do you have any objective evidence? And the prosecutor says, well, no, we don't have any objective evidence either. And then you just see the defense lawyer smirk and say, I motion to dismiss the case. Again, for emphasis, every testimony of a miracle might be reporting the truth. However, without sufficient objective evidence, reasonable people should not accept any of them, and without any objective evidence at all, they should dismiss them all. In a like fashion, maybe aliens really did abduct a man, but without any objective evidence, there isn't any reason to believe his testimony. Objective evidence of his alien abduction would include things like him being beamed back down the very next day into a large crowd of family and friends as an older man, and view of the alien spaceship, who now shows a superior technological knowledge beyond our comprehension, having in his hand a mysterious rock not from our planet, who was implanted with a futuristic tracking device and is now able to predict the future with pinpoint accuracy. That's objective evidence. No reasonable person would reject his story, but we never have this kind of strong objective evidence, period. When I argue for the non-controversial idea that miracles require relevant objective evidence, many believers will quickly switch topics. Here are 4 ways they do. Believers will sidetrack us into explaining what science hasn't yet explained, even though science has amassed enormous amounts of information so far. They'll ask where this universe came from, or life itself. They'll ask for objective evidence of beauty. They'll go on to ask us to account for the laws of logic, or explain how we know we're not in a matrix or dreaming right now, or being deceived by the devil. These are all distractions or red herrings that take our attention away from the question at hand, that is, whether reasonable people can accept miracle claims such as a hand that instantaneously turned leprous, or a river that turned to blood, or a sun that stood still, or a man who was swallowed by a great fish who lived to tell about it. Some interpreters, of course, would disagree, but those are some of the miracles that many conservatives do believe in. These are many of those miracle claims in the Bible, and they're about the objective world. and therefore they require sufficient objective evidence, even if there is a God. A supposed revelation from a God who whispered privately into the ear of an alleged inspired writer is emphatically non-objective evidence for these claims. It's only subjective evidence of someone claiming to have heard God speak. 2. Believers will focus on irrelevant objective evidence like ancient manuscripts and archaeological findings. Yes, we have 4th century manuscripts, but that's only objective evidence of ancient non-eyewitness, 2nd, 3rd, 4th handed down hearsay testimony as written by authors who are not themselves eyewitnesses. So it's irrelevant. They point to objective evidence, such as the archaeological findings of the Pool of Siloam in Jerusalem, where Jesus supposedly told a blind man to go and be healed and was healed. But findings like these are not considered irrelevant objective evidence. At best, what Christians have are archaeological findings that are consistent with what they believe. They don't confirm what they believe in the same way as the city of Bethlehem is consistent with the claim Jesus was born of a virgin but doesn't confirm it, or as the city of Roswell, New Mexico is consistent with the claim aliens are real but doesn't confirm it. This kind of evidence is not unimportant, but it's still irrelevant to whether a miracle took place. Artifacts like these merely provide the backdrop for the tales being told and nothing more. They're akin to what Homer wrote in the Iliad and Odyssey about the miraculous deeds of the gods and goddesses, using identified places as backdrops. 3. They substitute irrelevant stories of extremely rare coincidental events as evidence of miracles. If you recover after being told you have a 1 in a million chance of being healed, that's not equivalent to a miracle, one that suspends natural law. It simply means you beat the odds, and it happens every day, every hour, and every minute around the globe. The reason believers see evidence of miracles and rare coincidences is simply because they're ignorant about statistics and the probabilities built on them. There can be no reasonable doubt about this. Statistician David Hand shows us this in his book, The Improbability Principle, Why Coincidences, Miracles, and Rare Events Happen Every Day. He convincingly shows us that extraordinary rare claims are anything but. In fact, they're commonplace. Not only that, we should all expect to experience a miracle roughly once every month. He's not a believer in supernatural miracles, though, saying no mystical or supernatural explanation is necessary to understand why someone is lucky enough to win the lottery twice or is destined to be hit by lightning 3 times and still survive. Unquote. He and a growing list of statisticians are making the same point. Extremely rare events within the natural world are not miracles, period. We should expect extremely rare events in our lives many times over. No gods make these events happen. 4. Believers will finally cry foul, claiming that the kind of objective evidence needed to believe cannot be found, as if we concocted this need precisely to deny miracles. No, this is simply what reasonable people need. If that's the case, then that's the case. Bite the bullet. Since reasonable people need this evidence, God is to be blamed for not providing it. Now, why would God create us as reasonable people, then not provide what reasonable people need? Once honest inquirers admit the objective evidence doesn't exist, they should stop complaining and be honest about its lack. It's that simple. If nothing else, the God who desired our belief could have waited until our present technological age to perform miracles, because people in this modern scientific age of ours needs to see the evidence. If God can send the Savior Jesus in the first testimony, in the first century, whose supposed death atoned for our sins and atoned for all the sins of the people in the past prior to his day, then that same God could have waited to send Jesus in the year 2020, which would also bring salvation to every person born before this day as well, which would just add 20 centuries of people to save, because that's what the theology teaches, that his death saved everybody in the past. So why not in 2020? Why not 2200? And so on. In today's world, it would be easy to provide objective evidence of the gospel miracles. Magicians and mentalists would watch Jesus to see if he could fool them, like what Penn and Teller do on their show. There would be thousands of cell phones that could document his birth, life, death, and resurrection. The raising of Lazarus out of his tomb would go viral. We could set up a watch party as Jesus was being put into his grave to document everything all weekend, especially his resurrection. We could ask the resurrected Jesus to tell us things that only the real Jesus could have known or said before he died. Photos could be compared. DNA tests could be conducted on the resurrected body of Jesus, which could prove it if they had snatched a piece of skin from the real Jesus before he died. Plus, everyone in the world would be able to watch as he ascended back into the sky. This is how to properly think of miracle claims. We simply have to ask for relevant objective evidence. Now, if it doesn't exist, then say so, say why, and be done with it. Just dismiss those claims like reasonable people do to a myriad number of miracle claims from the beginning of time, period. There's a great advantage with this approach. By showing the need for objective evidence, then dismissing a miracle claim because of its lack, it might do more to convince believers than anything else we could do. For if we take some miracles more seriously than others, we unwittingly and unjustly make those particular miracles more credible than other miracle claims just by the fact that we're dealing with them. The more time we spend on them, the more credible those miracles appear to be. The bigger and more sophisticated the approach is, the more credible those miracles appear to be as well. Just consider whether pigs can fly of their own power. When it comes to flying pigs, we have no objective evidence to verify that any of them has ever flown of their own power, for a pig cannot fly of its own power, given the nature of a pig. It's too heavy, plus it doesn't have wings or jet propulsion capabilities. You can name a bird Piggy, and that animal can fly, but this isn't the animal I'm referring to. Such a claim is actually taken seriously in the Bible, for in it we find a talking snake and donkey. We also have a worldwide flood and an axe head that floated on water. We have a raging fire that didn't burn 3 men to death. We have 3 people who levitated, 2 of whom were supposedly dead, and more. Claims which have no objective evidence for them at all and should be dismissed outright as mythical. These are some of the many unevidenced miracle claims in the Bible that we can legitimately and rationally dismiss out of hand, even if there is a God. But what about others? What about a virgin birth deity? Just ask for the objective evidence. You don't need to do anything until that evidence is presented. Until then, it should be dismissed out of hand. The fact is, there's no objective evidence to corroborate Mary's story. We hear nothing about her wearing a misogynistic chastity belt to prove her virginity. No one checked for an intact hymen before she gave birth, either. After Jesus was born, Maury Povich wasn't there with a DNA test to verify Joseph is not the baby daddy. We don't even have first-hand testimonial evidence for it, since the story is related to us by others, not Mary or Joseph. At best, all we have is second-hand testimony reported in just 2 anonymous Gospels by one person, Mary, or 2 if we include Joseph, who was incredulously convinced Mary was a virgin because of a dream. Yes, that's what it says, a dream. Matthew chapter 1. We never get to independently cross-examine them along with the people who knew them, which we would want to do, since they may have a very good reason for lying. Pregnancy out of wedlock, anyway? Now, one might simply trust the anonymous gospel writers who wrote this miraculous tale down, but why? How is it possible they could find out that a virgin named Mary gave birth to a deity? Think about how they would go about researching that. No reasonable investigation could take Mary and Joseph's word for it. With regard to Joseph's dream, Thomas Hobbes tells us, for a man, he says, to say God hath spoken to him in a dream is no more than to say he dreamed that God spake to him, which is not a force to win belief from any man. So the testimonial evidence is down to one person, Mary. And that's, again, second-hand hearsay at best. Why should we believe that testimony? On this fact, Christian believers are faced with a serious dilemma to their faith. For if this is the kind of research that went into writing the Gospels by taking Mary's word and Joseph's dream as evidence, we shouldn't believe anything else they say without corroborating objective evidence. What about the resurrection of Jesus? Why do people treat that miracle any differently than levitating saints or a virgin birth God? The resurrection tale is reported in the same Gospels that record the virgin birth of a deity. So if the one is to be dismissed because it's unevidenced, so should the other. Are you catching on yet? Keep in mind we're talking about miracle claims from an era that Richard Carrier described in an essay titled Kooks and Quacks of the Roman Empire, A Look into the World of the Gospels, where he concludes, The age of Jesus was not an age of critical reflection and remarkable religious acumen. It was an era filled with con artists, gullible believers, martyrs without a cause, and reputed miracles of every variety. In light of this picture, the tales of the Gospels do not seem very remarkable. Even if they were false in every detail, there's no evidence that they would have been disbelieved or rejected as absurd by many people who at the time had little in the way of education or critical thinking skills. They had no newspapers, telephones, photographs, or public documents to consult to check a story. If they were not a witness, all they had was a man's word, and even if they were a witness, the tales tell us that even then their skills of critical reflection were lacking. What we find exclusively on behalf of miracles in the Bible is human testimony, ancient, pre-scientific, supernatural, superstitious human testimony, second, third, fourth-handed human testimony, conflicting human testimony, filtered by editors, redactors, and shaped by early Christian debates for decades and centuries in the ancient pre-scientific world, where miracle claims were abundant without the means to discredit them. What we don't find is any relevant objective evidence for any of them. Therefore, if we want to be reasonable, we should be honest, we should dismiss them out of hand. Now I want to end by talking briefly about Bayes' theorem. In his writings and talks, Richard Carey does a good job of explaining it. It asks us to input a number which we consider the prior probability of a given hypothesis we wish to test, say of whether a crime took place. Then it asks us to input some numbers for important posterior questions like, what should we expect to find if a crime took place compared to if it didn't? For instance, we might expect to find a dead body showing evidence of a struggle as opposed to a dead body lying peacefully in bed. Then it asks us to input numbers for the relevant background factors that would increase or decrease that prior probability, like if the suspect had a motive for murdering the victim or if the victim was suicidal, and so on. After inputting the numbers in the equation, we do the calculations and the resulting percentage is the probability that a crime took place. Now, I don't object to using the Bayes' theorem when it's applied appropriately to questions for which we have prior data to determine their initial probability. But Bayes' theorem is treated by some people as the only tool in their tools chest. To people who only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. That's the problem. And I have 5